Described as an unofficial shift change. We have seen for about the past half hour a number of New York City firefighters principally leaving here, leaving the scene, moving out along with their vehicles. In many cases, those vehicles in total disarray, seriously damaged. We were able to grab one of them to speak to us. This is firefighter Anthony Pasquarelli. Am I getting that right, from Engine 204?
Yes.
Can you tell us, first of all, when you got here?
Approximately 12 o'clock. And like you said, there's no words to describe what happened. There's numerous companies that are still in there, and you know.
Now, have you heard the reports? We have heard a report from the New York City Firefighters Union that perhaps as many as half of the original firefighters who responded, perhaps as many as 10 or 11 companies, perhaps 200 men have been lost.
We operate inside the building, you know. So it's a possibility. Nobody wants to hope. I'm hoping everybody pulls through. You know, hopefully God's with us. So
is that word making its way through amongst the rescue workers through the afternoon?
No, nobody's going to say anything until they have a definite answer. Mm-hmm. Like I said, everybody hopes that everyone pulls through. Nobody wants to come up with a number yet. We're still hopeful.
Tell me what is going on in there over the last 2 or 3 hours. Are you still fighting fires in there?
Yes, there's numerous high-rises that are still on fire that we're trying to battle, and we can't get close to it because of the rubble piled up as much as 100 feet. So it's just a tremendous effort with all the agencies of the city.
How many firefighters would you say and other rescue workers are in there working on these fires?
Like I said, it's hard to say. This is probably 3/4 of the city here. Mm-hmm. You know, they were pulling people off vacation, whoever wasn't working. So
the fire's still burning in there. Have you heard of any buildings that may still be in danger?
No, none at this time. The last one, I believe, was 7 World Trade over here, and nothing at this time, though.
Yeah. You said the rubble. If you give me some idea of the rubble, how big it is, how much there is. I mean, the thought of 100
blocks. It's a 40-story building, and both World Trade Centers and all the little buildings that were surrounding. It's just blocks of rubble. There's no way to describe it unless you're actually up there looking at it. They're sending everybody back to get rest because, like I said, the city's hurting for members, and they're going to need everyone fresh for the rest of the city. God forbid something happens anywhere else. So they're returning companies to get rest and wash up at the firehouse, but we have to stay at the firehouse, in case anything happens.
So. Firefighter Anthony Pasquarelli, thank you so much. We know it's been a very difficult day for you. Thank you. Firefighter Anthony Pasquarelli, the New York Fire Department, Engine 204, who, as he said, has been here, Tom, since about noon this afternoon. He relays the information that is not terribly optimistic in the fact that they are still fighting fires in there, and they are having a very, very difficult time getting to them because of the enormous amount of debris. As he described, a 40-story skyscraper and 2 110-story towers coming down. The debris, obviously, extraordinarily difficult to work your way through. Tom?
All right, thank you very much. Pat Dawson, still on the scene in Midtown Manhattan. We want to
just before we go to our next report, and as we look at Lower Manhattan, I just want to remind you of some basic things. There is, in the distance late this evening, is the skeleton of the front entrance, of one of the World Trade Towers on the west side of New York, and that is what's left. And we had that young man go down today, and 110 stories up. You see that photograph on the right? 110 stories up. On the right would have been the top of the trade tower, the single trade tower, and that, go back to the nighttime shot if we would, that is what is left this evening of the twin trade towers on the west side of lower New York City. 50,000 people worked in there. One of the hardest things to grasp all day is it happened just before 9 o'clock. How many people were at work? How many people managed to get out? How many people survived? First, the attack on the building. At 9:03 a.m. when the first attack occurred, and the second, sorry, at 9:03, just before 9 o'clock, the first attack, then the second one at 9:03, and then when these buildings collapsed at 10:28 approximately in the morning. And that is the number one question, I think, for everybody in the country, even paramount at the moment, to trying to find out who the perpetrators of this terrorism were. But it is part of our job to throw the net around the rest of the world and talk to our assets about why we might suspect one individual or another, and criticize, if we will, the fact that bin Laden's name, Osama bin Laden, Saudi citizen, Saudi millionaire, who has helped to finance a lot of operations in the world in the view of the United States. It's inevitable at a moment like this that his name comes up to the top. ABC's John Cooley, who's covered the Middle East and intelligence matters in the Middle East at every single level for us for almost 30 years, points out a short while ago in a message to us that maybe bin Laden is one of the obvious perpetrators here, but it's Cooley's judgment at this point, but acting on his own. John Miller, just confirm for me, Osama bin Laden is a loner. He does not act in concert with government, or we've not seen any evidence of that, I believe, even though the Taliban in Afghanistan have given him some measure of protection. Fair comment?
Fair comment. The only indication we've seen of that is that bin Laden's people, according to U.S. intelligence, have cross-trained with Hezbollah, which, of course, had a very tight relationship with the Iranian government, but not with Iraq, not with Libya.
Okay. Let's hold this thought, because, in fact, Senator Hatch has called us from Washington. Senator Hatch, do you hear me?
Yeah, you called me.
Well, I'm very glad to say that we did.
Okay.
And whoever called who, you're being quoted pretty widely at the moment as inferring, and you're a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, or the senior Republican on the Judiciary Committee, rather. You're being interpreted fairly widely as believing, in the wake of this attack today, that you know some connection between it and Osama bin Laden. True or not?
Well, let me put it this way. I'm, as a ranking member on the Judiciary Committee, and as a twice member on the Intelligence Committee,
right. I
chatted with the top law enforcement people, the top people at the CIA, and they made it very clear that, to me, that just about everything points in the direction of Osama bin Laden. There's no question that they intercepted information that included people associated with Osama bin Laden who acknowledged that a couple of targets were hit.
Everybody in the world knew a couple of targets were hit, Senator.
Well,
did you press the question?
This is look, Peter. Don't give me that. These are people at the top of the CIA, and I'm just saying that that's what they said. And keep in mind, bin Laden said it was every Muslim's duty to kill Americans. We know that people associated with bin Laden are taking pleasure in this attack. We know there's some data on people on the aircraft who appear to be associated with bin Laden. They're still studying this, so they're not positive, but they appear to be associated with bin Laden. And, you know, we also are pretty darn sure that bin Laden was behind the attack on the USS Cole. So these are things that are very, very serious. Almost everything points to them, and it's a serious situation.
Yeah, I don't mean, Senator, to underestimate the potential of Mr. bin Laden. We're just trying to get at what you know today.
That's what I know today. Now,
Senator, forgive me.
Sure.
The Associated Press also says, quote, attributes to you the information that law enforcement has data possibly linking one person on one of the 4 ill-fated flights to be members of bin Laden's organization. Is that true, sir?
It was told to me that there is some data on people on the aircraft who appear to be associated with bin Laden. I don't know which aircraft. I didn't ask that question.
Okay. I appreciate...
But they did say that they're still studying this, and they're going to try and verify that and bring that down to reality. But these are all just matters that appear to be, to be pointing in the direction of Osama bin Laden.
Okay. I appreciate very much, Senator, getting you on the telephone this evening and you clarifying for that. Just to reconfirm before we lose you.
Sure.
You, as you told Barbara Walters and the Associated Press, you've been talking to U.S. intelligence, and they've told you they intercepted communications between bin Laden supporters discussing the attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon.
But to give you the exact language, it was that they got information that included people associated with Osama bin Laden, where they acknowledged that a couple of targets were hit. They didn't name the targets, but you have to presume. And this is top intelligence information that they told me I could comment about.
Okay, thank you very much, Senator Hatch. Appreciate you taking the time.
You bet.
Glad we were able to find you.
Okay.
So the senator does confirm that what he said to the Associated Press and Barbara Walters is what he actually heard from senior officials in the CIA, which takes us back, of course, to Mr. bin Laden. And there has been no one in the history of international terrorism who's been more elusive, who has stymied the United States to any greater degree. And we were talking just a minute ago about ABC's John Cooley, who's covered intelligence on the ground throughout the Middle East, and he makes a couple of observations which are quite fascinating. They're all speculation. They're all speculation. We're all involved in speculation today about bin Laden. But John Cooley says the Taliban could in some way assist bin Laden, giving him access, this is very interesting, John, to former Afghan Air Force pilots who were trained during the Soviet era, when the United States was, of course, using Afghanistan as a bulwark against the Soviet Union to some extent. He points out that Jane's Defense Weekly, one of the most authoritative defense journals in the world, recently did a recent review of bin Laden's military capability globally, which they did conclude was impressive, well-organized, and very wealthy. And I think everybody knows that. Am I right, John?
That's true, and I have to point out a couple of interesting facts about bin Laden, underlining that I continue to join in speculation. Number one, we learned in the embassy bombing trial that bin Laden had hired pilots and obtained surplus military aircraft to transport his people around. So there is a history of having trained people, professional aircraft pilots, to fly big planes, in this case, the smaller versions of the C-130. We also know from the same case that bin Laden had recruited former Egyptian military people who actually, one of them, Sergeant Ali Mohammed, became a U.S. military advisor with U.S. Special Forces. So the idea that it would be far-fetched for him to have imported the type of expertise who could give people, and forgive the irony of this statement, a crash course in how to operate a large jet, is not as far-fetched as you might think.
Exactly. It's interesting that John Cooley should remind us, and I should remind people at home, that you're one of the only journalists in the world who's actually gone to see Osama bin Laden and interview him. Oh, we're talking 3 years ago now?
This would have been in May of 1998, and the statements he made that day really portended the future. He said, and I quote, "It will be a dark day for America. We will send their sons home in coffins and in boxes." And he underlined not just people in military uniform, but civilians too. They are all a target of this fatwa, unquote. It was the first time he underscored that this is no longer bin Laden against the forces of the U.S. government. This was bin Laden against the American people, civilians included. It was 6 weeks after he made that statement in July when he, according to U.S. officials, blew up the 2 East African embassies, thus carrying out the threat he made. Right. And he has threatened several times, including once recently, to launch more attacks. In his latest video, essentially claiming credit for the Cole attack, or at least cheering it on.
This was the attack that appeared on Middle East television, and I think occurred at the time of his daughter's or his son's wedding.
It's the one even after that where he released a kind of a training video showing himself shooting guns and showing U.S. leaders and targets and so on. So he has underlined the threat that it's a continuing one.
All right, just to make clear to people at home, we're persisting with the questioning on this issue of anybody we talk to in the Intelligence Committee or with access to it, so that the country does not rush to judgment, even though, as John Miller and Senator Hatch most recently and others, John Cooley, our correspondent in the Middle East, make clear that Osama bin Laden is certainly a logical person to put at the very head of the suspect list.
His wife was Barbara Olson, who appeared on this program so many times in the last 4 weeks, almost every night. Barbara Olson was on American Air Flight 77 that left Dulles, bound for Los Angeles, and crashed into the Pentagon. I spoke to Ted Olson today briefly, and it was just sad, so sad to speak to someone who had just lost his wife. Another gentleman who spoke to him was a much closer friend to the Olson family. He's Tim O'Brien, CNN correspondent. He called Ted on the phone. We understand, Tim, that you were at their wedding.
I was in their wedding. I was also out at his house this afternoon along with a number of other friends. It was a very sad afternoon.
Now, I know he told us she called him, but he went into detail with you. What happened during that call? This is the only information we have on these terrorists.
She was able to call him twice. How she could pull that off, we don't know, but she did. The phone went dead the first time after a very brief conversation, maybe less than a minute, and she called him back. And she said to him, "What do I tell the pilot to do?" Vintage Barbara, ready to take charge. She was in the back of the plane, huddled with other passengers, and we're told flight personnel and presumably the pilot. She said that they were armed with knives and box cutters, cardboard cutters. If they were armed with other weapons, such as machine guns or any kind of gun, you'd think she might have said that first, but she said no, knives and box cutters. I asked Ted, did she tell you how many people were there, how many hijackers were there? And Ted said no, but she referred to them in the plural, so there was more than one. What about nationality? Did you get any sense of that? No. Motives? No.
They were all in the back of the plane, right, Tim? The pilots and the passengers were herded to the back of the 757.
That's the understanding I get from Ted, correct.
So whoever took over that plane was up front, and one of them had to know how to fly it.
Presumably that's the case, yeah, but you know that's speculation, and we don't know for sure. It's conceivable there was a co-pilot who still may have been in the cockpit. We don't know, but there were flight personnel and most of the passengers huddled in the back. Incidentally, Barbara was not supposed to be on that flight today. Her original plan was to fly to California yesterday. Today is Ted Olson's birthday, and she wanted to be with him last night, and so that was the cost.
And when she was on the phone, Ted had already known about the crashes in New York, right?
That is correct, and he did tell her about that, so she had a good idea of what she was up against. She knew about the two crashes at the World Trade Center.
But fires are still burning here tonight, smoldering in the remains of the World Trade Center, also in a nearby hotel, and in the rubble of that 47-story tower that collapsed late this afternoon. Once the smoke clears, construction equipment that's been standing by will move in to begin the grisly task of clearing the rubble and recovering the bodies of the victims, and there are likely thousands of them. One of New York's Twin Towers is ripped and burning, the target of a hijacked jet. And then, minutes later, another airliner hits the second tower of the World Trade Center, and a storm of wreckage and debris rains on crowds of people below. Dozens of workers trapped on high floors in the 110-story buildings fear there is no hope and leap to their deaths. But the horror is not over. As the buildings are evacuated and hundreds of firefighters and rescue personnel tend to the injured and secure the scene, the first tower collapses in a cloud of smoke and rubble, trapping and killing many on the ground. And then, just as the smoke clears and police and emergency workers start returning to the scene, the second tower comes crashing down.
There was a big shaking. Some of the ceilings collapsed. Looks like there was a fire in the elevator shafts. And they brought everyone down and started bringing everybody down the stairs.
So you came down from the 77th floor.
77th floor, down the stairs.
Meanwhile, two more hijacked planes are headed for high-profile targets. One hits the Pentagon, the other crashes and burns outside Pittsburgh, possibly headed for Camp David.
These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice.
Hours later, the fire still burns in the cratered remains of the World Trade Center. And a third building at the site, a 47-story tower, falls to earth. At least 400 firefighters reached the scene before this morning's collapse of that first tower. Half of them are feared dead. 78 police officers also missing and unaccounted for, and New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani says it could be at least 2 days before the total number of injured and dead can be determined. Of course, all this happening on a day that can never be forgotten, September 11th, also known as 911. Reporting live in New York City, Rick Leventhal, Fox News.
Thank you.
The whole building has collapsed?
The building has collapsed.
That's the southern tower you're talking about.
Exactly, the second building that we witnessed the airplane enter.
On the ground, emergency services hardly knew which way to turn. People still trapped in the second tower had seen it all and could only wave in desperation. But it was already too late for rescue. The second tower, representing America's trade and wealth, was about to go. The Twin Towers, which took 7 years to build, had been utterly destroyed in a single morning. The Manhattan skyline and countless lives devastated.
Do not go down on the ground. You will get trapped. You will get trapped. Don't go.
Big boom. Come down the steps. Everything fine till we got to the basement, and then everything just fell in. I got trapped under there with another guy. Crawled out. Kept getting hit in the head. Bags rolled around. Finally, we clawed our way out over the rubble.
Yeah.
Come on down.
You did all right. All right, way to be, Tom. Let's go.
Even the bloodied felt incredibly lucky on this terrible day. And firefighters could embrace each other for a few moments before facing many more hours of trauma. As New York struggled to cope, to adapt to the clogging dust, the fallout of so much tragedy, more news was coming in, a fourth crashed airliner in Pittsburgh. And somehow American government seemed almost powerless amidst all this. The centers of that power had been evacuated, key congressional leaders taken to secret locations. The president himself whisked to a nuclear bunker in Nebraska, shaken but pledging somehow to find those who masterminded this day of mayhem and massacre.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward. And freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
Hours after the attacks, the United States, the whole world, is struggling to take it all in. There's really no more rescue the firemen can seriously attempt. It's now a question of salvage amid the wreckage, as others in New York try to establish how many men, women and children have been lost. A priest picks his way through the New York ruins. The World Trade Center has been reduced to the stumps of skyscrapers that once helped define one of the world's most vibrant cities, normally loud with life. An entire society feels itself violated by terror. James Robbins, BBC News.